Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Happiness Journey with Dr. Dan podcast, where every journey is worth living. My name is Dr. Dan, and I'm your host for today's episode. I'm a bilingual neurolinguistic programming and cognitive behavior psychotherapist specializing in anger management issues, both court appointed and private, marriage counseling using the EFT method, dissociative disorders, narcissistic personality disorders, depression, anxiety, dream analysis, and also provide life, business, and retirement coaching support. I provide individual one-on-one sessions in both French or English, and also do group settings. If you need any assistance, reach out to DMV Therapy and Coaching Services at 301-325-1550, and our website can be found at lifecoachdanamtlag.com. Today, I'm very excited to have for our first episode of season 16, a very special guest and author of Preyed Upon, sharing experience as a survivor of both sexual abuse as a child and adult at the hands of a mental health professional, Amy Nordhues. And just like every of my past episode, I will leave it up to the guests to properly introduce themselves, as no one can do a better job. Amy, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And thank you so much for having me.
Of
My
course.
name is Amy Nordhues. And like you said, I wrote a book called Preyed Upon, Breaking Free from Therapist Abuse. In 2014, I was actually groomed and then sexually assaulted by my therapist, who was also a psychiatrist and was also an elder at my church. I went to therapy really just for lingering depression stemming from childhood sexual abuse. I wanted to work on my marriage. I wanted to work on my parenting, things like that. I was new to this Christian world, you could say. And so I was a little naive in that regard. And he was a, spiritual leader and um, kind of a Bible scholar. And so I respected him for that. And I was a little more open to what he had to say as a result of that. He, I heard you mention dissociative identity disorder. He diagnosed his victims with multiple personalities. He also told us that we had evil spirits. And while that sounds ludicrous, I heard a lot about evil spirits growing up. A lot of things in my household were blamed on that. And I honestly was so desperate for help and so tired of not being able to free myself from depression that I thought, sure, why not? Why not be open to the spiritual as well? So that's kind of how we got started. I won't launch into the grooming process, but I basically got out a year and a half later and I needed help to get out. So I had reported to my pastor, and he was the one who helped me to break that initial tie.
Well, thank you.
Now,
Yes.
now I advocate for adult victims because you have no idea the shame that comes with abuse as an adult.
I could imagine, absolutely. And thank you so much for being able to share your story. We're going to jump into the question and answer. Obviously, a lot of people would like to be able to know what signs, Amy, to pay attention, because you mentioned about the grooming part. So what can our listeners, in case they're going through the same ordeal, what signs should they really pay attention to know that they're directed towards something that is outside of the relationship between a psychiatrist and their patient?
Yes, my abuser invaded my personal space right away by covering me up with a blanket in kind of a playful way. And I kind of blew it off as he was just being kind of silly and playful, but that is absolutely inappropriate. Maybe a hug at the end of a session, maybe a handshake. That is it. No personal contact, physical contact, I mean. Contact outside of sessions, except for just, rescheduling an appointment.
Okay.
My sessions ran long. That's a huge red flag. You should see your therapist for the agreed upon time, whether it's 45 minutes or an hour, once a week, period. You should always pay for your sessions.
Yes.
After I'd seen him for a while, he stopped charging me, and it made me very uncomfortable, but I thought, oh, my insurance is going to kick back in, here in a few months. But that is not okay. Personal sharing, your therapist sharing with you about their life or their struggles is an absolute red flag. They have to share enough, yes, to establish a bond with their client, but you are certainly the star of the show in your own therapy. Sharing about other clients. There's so many more, and I'm trying to think. You know, when you're being groomed, it feels good. the word grooming sounds creepy and scary, but it actually feels good at the time when it's happening. Predators will love bomb you, make you feel like you're special, make you feel like you're unique. And again, a therapist does need to establish rapport with the client. But if you ever feel singled out, that we have a bond that's unique, um, I I relate to you so much more than my other clients. It's almost like not doing therapy with you. That's a huge red flag.
Okay.
And the biggest piece of advice I could give is staying connected to your outside world, because these little red flags are going to seem very innocuous at the time. You're not going to link them together. You do not assume you are sitting across from a serial predator. So never in your wildest dreams are you going to imagine that this is a pattern. You're going to think that what he's saying and doing with you is unique to you. You're going to think you're the only victim. So your mind is not going to, question, the wrongdoing there.
Let's see.
And so they will try to isolate you away from these significant others in your life. And that is the biggest danger, because when the abuser, who you don't know is an abuser at the time, there may be a hero or a savior and a father figure, somebody that makes you feel good and heard and seen, when they become more the focus of your world and friends and family start to fall away, you're in dangerous waters.
So did he go immediately into making you feel this way, or that was a long, I would say, from the first session till the session that you start feeling uncomfortable? Was it like a week, 2 weeks, 6, 7, 10 sessions before you start realizing that he has ulterior motives?
Honestly, I started seeing him in April of 2013. Christmas that year, so what is that, about 8 months, was when I noticed the first, what I would say is a red flag. There were many red flags before that, but that is when he offered to rub my shoulders or my feet for a Christmas present.
Oh yeah.
Now, I was panicked and I froze, as I always do. But that was the first big one. And I just kind of put it in the back of my mind, like, that's really odd. Hopefully that'll never happen again. And I did run it by my mentor, who was the pastor's wife, and she thought it was sweet. Now, that's the problem. My circle was very small. So the only other person that was really in my inner circle besides my therapist was the pastor's wife. And guess what? He'd already groomed her. She was already his biggest fan.
Yes.
So, I was really in a dangerous situation there. That's why I say you've got to keep your circle wide. You've got to let other people know what's happening in therapy, because you might not be able to see it. And you might tell someone who is less healthy than you are.
Okay.
And yeah,
And now, from after that point, the full-fledged sexual assault, etc. Did you go to the police to be able to file this, or did you just didn't want to be able to be connected with that person anymore, and you just kind of like left therapy and you just moved on?
I wanted to just crawl under a rock and move on, but I couldn't. I shared with my husband, and then eventually I decided that I had to do something. I had to fight for myself in some way. So I went to the medical board, because my therapist was also a medical doctor. And it took about 9 months to a year, but they eventually allowed him to surrender his license.
Okay.
They would have rather taken it from him, but they didn't want to risk it with only, one victim. So they just allowed him to surrender it. I was told by two very skilled attorneys in this area that if I filed criminal charges, although I might have a strong enough rape case to do so, it would destroy me and my family, and the abuser would likely walk.
Even if you had the proof and all?
Well, how are you going to have proof with no witnesses?
Well, that is a good point, yes. But I mean, it's obviously there was somehow of a way, especially after the thing happened. Didn't you go to the hospital to say, hey, this, we need to do a rape case, or take some samples or something?
I didn't. One, because when I first got out, I thought it was partly my fault. Because
Okay.
I thought if I didn't want a father figure so badly, I wouldn't have let this go on so long. And so telling on the abuser felt like telling on myself. It felt humiliating. And then two, intercourse was not a part. So but I did think about it. I really thought his office was right across from the hospital. And one day I just sat in the parking lot and thought, what would they think if I just went in there and told them what my psychiatrist just asked of me? But no, I did not.
Okay. How did you move on after all this? I mean, how did that affect you emotionally, spiritually, mentally, and all? Did you not trust any more therapists after what happened, or is it was just a specific, like situation that this person just did what he did? I mean, I'm sure that you're not the only victim. That's for sure.
Oh, no. And other victims did come forward eventually, but it destroyed my entire world. I felt suicidal. It damaged my marriage. It damaged my family. It robbed me of friends and church family. It robbed me of everything. But I made the decision that I was going to not let the abuser take any more from me than he already had. So I was not going to be afraid of all therapists. I was not going to become angry and bitter and untrusting. So, and it was hard, but I did seek out a therapist and I did a year of EMDR, and that was very helpful.
Yeah.
And then years later, I called this kind of abuse like kind of like an earthquake, where you have the initial trauma and then you have smaller quakes after that. And that can go on for months or years. So when my family started to implode, as a result, I did seek out a male therapist. I had to speak to him on the phone ahead of time just so that we were clear on certain boundaries. And then I did feel safe and I went and had a good experience.
So how did EMDR help you?
EMDR, you try to get to the root of the moment or point of, the highest, how can I say it? The peak of the traumatic experience you just went to. If you could pinpoint it down, and I did that, I could pinpoint it down to a moment. And we did EMDR week after week. And pretty soon, I want to say it took months and months. And then we would move to another piece of the trauma. But it was so interesting because it would just lessen in intensity to where it wasn't in the front of my radar screen anymore. And we did that for a full year until, guess what? The doctor was no longer at the forefront of my issues at all. Didn't even pop up anymore as, you know, the most traumatic event I was dealing with at the time. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. I mean, when you say EMDR, this is the eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, right? Okay, so
Yeah.
this is mostly used for addiction. So I'm not sure how what happened in your rape case that was going to help you process all of that. Did they who suggested that EMDR would be the best case scenario or the best therapy?
Honestly, just from past experience with it and from reading about it, I know a therapist who works with the military, and they use a lot of EMDR for post-traumatic stress
Okay.
for soldiers in combat. So, as from what I've read, I thought it was good for trauma of any kind.
And after
But
what
it wasn't recommended to me. It was something that I chose to pursue.
I see. That's what I was just wondering because, like I said, we do this a lot with addiction, drug addiction, substance abuse, etc. It could be used for post-traumatic, but I don't know. I wasn't sure exactly in this case scenario, how long did you start feeling the changes and the positive changes coming into your life by using EMDR or by going through the process?
I felt like it took me about a year.
A year, okay.
The doctor was the assault by the doctor was the focus of my EMDR for a year, and then it kind of fell by the wayside as not being as significant anymore.
And now you still in therapy, Amy, or you kind of like now you have set up some coping mechanism to be able to deal with any past memories that are reminiscing from the abuse. What do you do now to be able to cope with those memories?
Well, part of my healing came through my faith. Um, Part of it just took time and doing the internal work needed to forgive myself, because honestly, I was able to move past and sort of forgive, I put in air quotes, my abuser before I could forgive myself. I actually wrote my book because I refused to forgive myself when I didn't understand it. And I felt like I blame you until you can prove otherwise.
Hmm.
And it took me the writing of the book, which was over a period of 6 years, and lots of time and hard work to come to that realization that I was a victim 100%. And that's where the true freedom comes. And I think that's where a lot of adult victims get stuck, is that we can't untangle the pieces that tell us, well, maybe we didn't cause it, maybe we didn't want it, but we participated in it. And maybe if we decide, well, we didn't really want to participate, but we allowed it, we stayed. And it takes a lot of time and work to get to the point where we can say, I was 100% a victim, and this wouldn't have happened to me if I hadn't encountered a predator. It doesn't matter if we were needy. It doesn't matter if we were vulnerable. It doesn't matter what we were wearing. It absolutely doesn't matter. It was the professional's job always to keep us in a safe space.
Absolutely. And do you feel that it was because he was faith-based pastor that made it much easier for him to take advantage?
Yes, because in the past, that would have turned me off. I would have been triggered by that. But I was sort of this brand new Christian, and learning about it and learning more about the Bible and really enamored with it, that made me very vulnerable. And that gave him a really big shoe in taking advantage of me. Now, I don't go to church. I would like to maybe again someday. I have a really hard time with pastors. I don't know which ones I can trust and which ones I can't. But yes, at the time, that was a big piece of it.
You said earlier that this cost you your marriage. Now, did you get divorced because of what happened, or is it because how you coped with the outcome of this issue?
No, and when I say it cost me my marriage, I say it put us through hell.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
and he at first saw it as an affair, as I knew he would, because I couldn't explain it to myself. How could I explain it to other people? I knew I didn't want it, but I stayed. So what am I supposed to say? And so it was brutal. But we eventually, came together. He eventually saw that it wasn't my character and that I was absolutely taken advantage of. And then he has been my biggest supporter. It sort of had to destroy our relationship, though, kind of down to the rafters. And then we rebuilt. And what we have now is something stronger.
Okay. So for the way that you work with your husband through this very, very difficult time, was it in a way for him to be able to kind of understand that you were the victim versus you were just using this as an excuse to stay with that pastor, even though you knew that you were getting abused?
Yes, there aren't a lot of resources, sadly, for these spouses. There's an organization called TELL, which is Therapy Exploitation Linkline, and they have articles on their website that speak to the spouses as secondary victims and help them see what happened. And I had the honor of speaking with a really wise psychologist out of Boston, and he asked me if I'd shared what happened with my husband. And I said, yes, I told him everything. And he said, well, that's a shame, because the first thing I do in these scenarios is sit down with the spouse and explain to them that their wife was a victim of a crime. And victims of crime don't owe explanations. But in sexual assault, we do.
Yes, and that's actually a very good point, because again, we don't know if it was voluntary or not at this point. Because if you stayed, then they will say, well, didn't you just leave after the first offense versus staying here longer? So that's why it's always questioning if it was deliberate or against your will.
Yeah, and it's really hard to explain psychological manipulation unless you've lived through it.
Right.
It's hard to explain that the hold they can have on you is insane.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
That's so you said that it took you 6 years to write your book after the end of the abuse. So why do you feel that the writing took so much time to organize it? Was it because you went through traumatic, so you had like a writer's block about it, or how?
Yeah. It was more like, I want to write this book, and then, oh my God, I don't want to write this book. This is too scary. And I don't want to put my personal business out for the world to judge. And then it was like, no, I should write this book. And so it was also, I had to heal enough. When I first wrote it, it's interesting. One of the chapter headings that I had implied blame on my part because I hadn't gotten far enough. And it took years until I looked at that and thought, why on earth would I have written it like that? So I couldn't put the book out until I had the healing under my belt to be able to tell other adult victims, look, this isn't your fault. So that's why it took so long. And then part of it was just fear of, wanting to put my story out there.
Was there a lot of anger against yourself for letting?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. The self-hatred is what kills us.
Okay.
Whether we keep the abuse secret, which is an extreme burden to carry, or we share and report it, the self-hatred is what keeps us stuck with abusers, because they have convinced us that whether or not we wanted what happened, we wanted the bond, or we wanted the relationship, or we wanted the feeling of special. And we hate ourselves for that so much that we stay stuck because we have to tell somebody in order to get out. And it feels so humiliating to admit that.
Mhm.
The self-hatred for me lasted years. And it took, for me, partly my faith, and then partly learning about abuse of power to be able to see it as it really was.
Did you
But
did you